This video is brought to you by Captivating History. The United States have been called the land of opportunity. Although the nation has been a beacon of democracy, a symbol of freedom, and a model of individual achievement, the United States is not free of its controversial history. From the horrors of colonialism to the battle over slavery, and the Jim Crow laws to the civil rights movement of the 1960s, it is clear that the United States was not the Mecca of liberty it was portrayed to be. Still, the American spirit, American dream, and American innovation are as palatable as the Statue of Liberty, Mount Rushmore, and the Lincoln Memorial. The United States was born of revolution, and in its relatively short 244-year history, it has witnessed some of the high points in human history and some of the most devastating lows. Here is the captivating tale of one of the world's greatest superpowers, a melting pot of people that sometimes boils over into social unrest. In the United States, school children were taught for many years that Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492. However, when Columbus set foot on Hispaniola, there were already people there. Both North and South America was populated with ancient indigenous people. Anthropologists believe that humans crossed a land bridge at the Bering Strait during the last ice age, and from there, their numbers spread throughout the Western Hemisphere. The native groups of South America, the incredible cultures of ancient Mesoamerica, Native America, and First Nation tribes of North America thrived for thousands of years before Columbus's arrival. Columbus wasn't even the first European in the New World. Norse and Viking explorers had already arrived in Greenland and parts of present-day Canada. Word spread of the riches of the New World. Although many tales about the wealth of the newly discovered continent were obvious exaggerations, like the stories of cities made of gold, there were enough natural resources to attract explorers from several European countries. People from Spain, England, Italy, France, and Portugal sailed to the Americas to stake their claim to the vast expanse of land. The English attempted to establish the first permanent colony in the United States in what is now Virginia. In 1587, more than 100 men, women, and children sailed to Roanoke Island and built a settlement. The colony's leader, John White, sailed back to England for supplies. But when he returned almost 3 years later, the entire colony had disappeared. The reasons remain a mystery to this day. Undeterred, the English sent John Smith to establish the Jamestown colony in 1604. This opened the door to more colonization efforts. A new and vast land beckoned people looking for adventure, people escaping economic turmoil, or people fleeing religious persecution, as was the case with the Pilgrims, who landed at Plymouth Rock in Massachusetts in 1620. Others were looking for opportunities. In England, land was scarce, and primogeniture was practiced. Only firstborn sons inherited land and estate, making land ownership an impossibility for second and thirdborn sons. Their only hope to build their own estates was to make a new start in America. By the mid-1700s, European colonies were prevalent up and down the east coast of the North American continent. A bold young Virginia landowner named George Washington made a name for himself as a military leader in the French and Indian War, which raged from 1754 to 1763. The English colonists were victorious over the outnumbered French, even with several Native American tribes on their side. The French and Indian War served as a dress rehearsal for the War for Independence, the Revolutionary War. As the American colonies grew, expanded, and became more organized, the colonists became disgruntled about how they were treated by the British Crown. The colonies were expected to pay their share of taxes, but had no voice in the British government. As the Revolutionary War broke out, George Washington was tasked with commanding the Continental Army. The colonists issued their Declaration of Independence from the British in 1776, but setting up the framework for a new democratic nation took much debate and discussion. The United States Constitution was finally ratified on September 17, 1787. Washington was elected to serve as the new country's first president. The new United States settled into an uneasy peace until they faced another threat from the British. The War of 1812 was fought because the British wanted to restrict the U.S. expansion across the North American continent and control U.S. trade. Years after the war, the United States and Britain buried the hatchet and became tight allies. In the 1800s, the United States was marked with the mistreatment of minorities. President Andrew Jackson advocated for the relocation of Native Americans from rich, fertile farmlands because he believed that white Americans had more of a right to the land than the indigenous people. Jackson's attitude toward the Native Americans culminated in the Indian Removal Act of 1830 and the horrific Trail of Tears, a forced march of over 60,000 Native Americans from their traditional homes in the southeastern part of the U.S. to designated reservation lands west of the Mississippi River. Approximately 4,000 people, many children, died during the treacherous journey. While the Native Americans were forcibly ripped from their homelands, another population of people in the United States endured the horrors of slavery. The African slave trade was a thriving business until Congress passed an act in 1808 that put a stop to the importation of slaves from Africa. However, it did not put an end to the institution of slavery in America. The large cotton and tobacco plantations of the South relied on slave labor to stay profitable. As the moral dilemma of slavery weighed on the minds of the industrial North, the issue became a wedge that drove apart the two halves of the country and sparked a war between the states. For 4 years, beginning in 1861, Americans fought Americans. Many of the southern states seceded from the U.S. to form their own country, the Confederate States of America. The fighting started at Fort Sumter just a few weeks after Abraham Lincoln was sworn in as president. The toll on the soldiers was tremendous. 750,000 people died in combat or from disease during the Civil War, more than all military deaths of U.S. soldiers from all other wars combined until the end of the Vietnam War in 1975. The Civil War ended when Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general, surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant, the Union general, on April 9, 1865, at the Appomattox Courthouse. With the fall of the Southern Confederacy, over 4 million slaves were freed. Free, however, did not mean equal. In the decades following the Civil War, American inventors created such life-changing things as the electric light bulb, the telephone, the automobile, the internal combustion engine, the assembly line, the teddy bear, the airplane, and the supermarket. As the United States progressed into a modern society and a world superpower, African Americans, Native Americans, and women were treated as second-class citizens. Jim Crow laws across the South were intended to prevent black people from achieving equality by openly discriminating against them. Blacks were granted the right to vote in U.S. elections in 1870, but were often prevented from voting by various discriminatory laws. Women earned the right to vote in 1920, and Native Americans in 1924. The United States was progressive and repressed simultaneously. A financial disaster and a man-made natural disaster knocked many Americans off the ladder of success they had been steadily climbing. On October 24, 1929, the years of lavish living on borrowed money caused the economy to collapse and the stock market to crash. Businesses went bankrupt, thousands of people lost their jobs, and the United States sank into the Great Depression. Adding to the woes was the Dust Bowl, the U.S.'s largest man-made environmental disaster, which occurred in the early 1930s. Irresponsible farming practices in the Great Plains set up a doomsday scenario in which the fertile topsoil, exposed to high winds and drought conditions, blew away. Farmers went bankrupt, and families lost their homes. This, coupled with the Great Depression, forced the United States government to enact programs such as Social Security, the Civilian Conservation Corps, farm reliefs, and banking reform to help get the country back on solid footing again. Just as the United States was recapturing its former glory, it was attacked on its soil. Political turmoil in Europe put most of that continent's countries at war with each other. Additionally, Japan and China were engaged in territorial conflict. Although it seemed as though much of the world was at war, the United States had avoided involvement until one fateful Sunday morning. Just before 8 a.m. on December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service commenced a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Over 2,000 people were killed, a dozen ships were destroyed, and a few hundred planes were damaged. In response to the unprovoked attack, President Franklin Roosevelt declared war on Japan the next day and announced that the United States was joining the Allied forces in Europe. The Americans were going to World War II. On the home front, American factories and businesses switched gears to manufacture the supplies needed to support the war effort, recruiting women in large numbers to keep the assembly lines humming along. On the war front, the death toll was high. The Nazis were killing millions of Jews in systematic extermination. The end of the fighting in Europe came after the Allied troops seized Berlin, and Nazi leader Adolf Hitler committed suicide. The official German surrender came on May 8, 1945. The fighting in the Pacific Theater raged on. With no end in sight, the Americans unleashed the destructive power of Robert Oppenheimer's newly developed atomic bomb on two Japanese cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, on August 6, 1945, and again 3 days later. More than 250,000 people died because of the two atomic bombs. Most were civilians. The Japanese emperor had no recourse but to surrender to the United States. In the decades following the end of World War II, the United States enjoyed unprecedented growth and progress. Most families owned at least one automobile and one television. Rock and roll was born. NASA launched rockets into space. Yet, minorities in America still felt the sting of discrimination. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and others spoke about the injustices to African Americans and urged Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Dr. King's tragic assassination in April of 1968 was sandwiched between two other high-profile political assassinations, that of President John F. Kennedy in November of 1963 and his brother, Attorney General Bobby Kennedy, in June of 1968. The 1960s was a tumultuous time, a time of great social change. On a clear blue September morning in 2001, the U.S. was jolted awake by a different threat, one that had never reached American soil: a terrorist attack. Members of the Middle Eastern terrorist group Al-Qaeda had pulled off a deadly attack on the unsuspecting Americans. 19 Al-Qaeda members hijacked 4 commercial planes, crashing 2 into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, 1 into the Pentagon, and 1 into a Pennsylvania field. Thousands died in the well-coordinated attack. The United States, under President George W. Bush, declared war on terrorism. It was a different war because the enemy was not a country, but radical factions within several different countries. In the years to come, the U.S. led a coalition of forces to defeat the terrorist Taliban in Afghanistan, captured Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein, and killed Osama bin Laden in a raid in Pakistan. On June 22, 2011, U.S. President Barack Obama delivered a televised speech in which he stated that the United States would begin a systematic pullout of troops in Afghanistan. At the end of 2014, Obama declared that the war in Afghanistan was officially over. The terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001 had a profound impact on the American way of life. Airport security was tightened. The Department of Homeland Security was created. Public security cameras became commonplace, and attitudes about immigration began to change. It also sparked a wave of patriotism that the nation hadn't seen in 50 years. In the decade and a half since that defining moment in American history, however, the country has become more divided than ever in its quest to recover from political, social, and economic issues that continue to plague its greatness. To discover more about the history of the United States, then check out our book, The History of the United States, a captivating guide to American history, including events such as the American Revolution, French and Indian War, Boston Tea Party, Pearl Harbor, and the Gulf War. It's available as an ebook, paperback, and audiobook. Also, grab your free Mythology Bundle ebook for free while still available. All links are in the description. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this.